The subcommittees on emergency preparedness, response and recovery, and oversight, management and accountability will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittees in recess at any point. Good morning to everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us today. We are here to discuss the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, its workforce. This topic is incredibly timely, given the tornadoes that struck Southwest Florida Sunday morning, destroying dozens of homes and leaving thousands without power in Lee and Charlotte counties. My thoughts are with the families, and we are committed to supporting their communities as they recover. I am grateful that FEMA is already on the ground assisting with the damage assessments necessary for federal assistance. Thank you, Chairman Correa and Ranking Member Meyer, for joining Ranking Member Kamek and me for this important hearing. I want to begin today's hearing by thanking the FEMA workforce for the job that they do every day. As an agency, they have worked nonstop to help those in need. I have witnessed FEMA come to the aid of hurting Floridians, and I am tremendously grateful for their service.
By for a little bit. Thank you very much.
I don't think that's something FEMA can help us with, but we're going to continue our meeting. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes,
Thank you.
yes.
Thank you all so much. Representative Correa, I'll just pick up where I left off. Um, Last weekend, the hostage situation in Colleyville, Texas, reminded us all just how important these grant programs are in addressing terrorist attacks and how much we rely on the FEMA workforce to keep our communities safe. The demand on FEMA's workforce is already immense, and it will only grow due to the frequency and intensity of natural disasters that are predicted to increase with climate change. To put things into perspective, the average number of major disaster declarations issued from 1960 to 1969 were roughly 18 per year. In contrast, in 2020, FEMA responded to a record 104 major disaster declarations, and in 2021, FEMA responded to 58 major disaster declarations. While FEMA has responded to disaster assistance missions over the years, an increasing workload has contributed to workforce challenges related to hiring, training, and retention. After the record breaking 217 hurricanes, and Accountability Office found that FEMA faced challenges in training employees and maintaining staffing levels across four concurrent disasters, which hindered the agency's response. Furthermore, in 2020, more FEMA workers transferred to other agencies than in any other year over the past decade. This mass exit may be attributed to the workload. Past employees have described working 12-hour days and not having enough time in between to recover between assignments. FEMA's workforce is suffering from an increase in burnout, and it is crucial that FEMA address these concerns and prioritize its workforce and their needs. Additionally, I am worried about the agency's lack of diversity, especially within its leadership roles. Only 24% of FEMA's senior executive service employees identified as minorities and 31% identified as female. Having a diverse workforce, as we all know, is critical to providing equitable and comprehensive disaster assistance. I am glad to see the Biden administration invest in FEMA's workforce and for releasing the 2022 to 2026 FEMA strategic plan that establishes three overarching goals for the next 5 years: improving equity in emergency management, leading the field in climate resilience, and ensuring FEMA is ready to respond to the many tasks the agency is assigned. It is with sincere gratitude that I welcome our witnesses here today. I look forward to hearing your perspectives on FEMA's workforce and what Congress can do to better support them moving forward. The ranking member has joined us. The chair will now recognize the ranking member from the Emergency Management Response and Recovery Subcommittee, the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Kamick, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Demings and Chairman Correa, for holding this important hearing today. There is a saying in the business world: a company is only as good as its employees. This can apply most places and certainly applies to FEMA, whose vital mission is to help people before, during, and after disasters. Now, when people think of FEMA, images are conjured of flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, the devastation of an entire town, like we sadly witnessed in Southwest Kentucky. However, in recent years, FEMA's mission sets have grown. In March of 2020, when President Trump declared a nationwide emergency due to the COVID-19 pandemic, FEMA took a lead role in our nation's response. In March of 2021, FEMA was tasked with providing operational support to the Department of Health and Human Services with unaccompanied children crossing the border. And most recently, in August and September of last year, FEMA assisted in the Afghan refugee resettlement efforts. Now, while FEMA employees are incredibly capable and resilient, I am concerned that these multiple mission sets are exhausting the workforce. This sentiment was echoed during FEMA Administrator Chris Wells' first all hands meeting, where she identified employee burnout as a major issue. Now, according to FEMA's 2021 preparedness report, quote, when multiple large-scale incidents require simultaneous support, state and federal capability may be strained, reducing capacity to ongoing recovery efforts and to respond to additional incidents. The report states that there are, quote, more disaster declarations open at the end of 2020 than at any other point since 1953, when the data collection actually began. Now, currently, the agency is responding to 77 presidential declared disasters. While employee fatigue poses extraordinary challenges at FEMA, a recent report by the GAO highlighted that, quote, disaster personnel experience significant limitations with qualification status matching performance in the field, meaning that staff members who were qualified in FEMA qualification system, the system that tracks the training and performance requirements for disaster workforce positions, did not have the skills or experience to effectively perform their positions in the field. The GAO additionally found that FEMA's disaster workforce encountered challenges related to the availability of courses, providing and receiving on-the-job training and mentoring, and consistently receiving performance evaluations, end quote. Now, these major shortcomings hindered staff development necessary to increasing the skills and competencies needed during these critical deployments. The GAO made 3 recommendations to FEMA, including developing a plan to address the challenges that have hindered FEMA's ability to provide reliable and complete information to field leaders and managers about staff knowledge, skills, and abilities. 2, develop mechanisms to assess how effectively FEMA's disaster workforce was deployed to meet mission needs in the field. And 3, create a staff development program for FEMA's disaster workforce. Now, further, due to allegations of misconduct at the agency in 2019, FEMA requested a study be conducted on harassment and discrimination in the FEMA workplace. The RAND Corporation managed a survey to, quote, designed to estimate the annual prevalence of workplace harassment and discrimination at FEMA and to assess employee perceptions of leadership and workforce climate. Of the personnel that completed the survey, about 29% of employees experienced sex, race, or ethnicity-based discrimination. As a result of the study, FEMA published their Culture Improvement Action Plan designed to increase employee awareness of the RAND survey results, provide transparent communication of workforce culture objectives, programs, and improvement and associated implementation timelines. It is my understanding that RAND has conducted a second survey. I look forward to learning of those results and hope that the agency culture has improved. With all the aforementioned challenges, employee fatigue, barriers to training, lacking necessary skills in the field, and prevalence of harassment and discrimination in the workplace, is the FEMA workforce prepared and well positioned to respond to the disasters when needed? I certainly hope so. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on their perspectives on these challenges and what steps the agency should take to move forward in a positive way. Now, before I yield back, I do want to take a moment to thank all of our incredible, hardworking, dedicated men and women at FEMA. You guys have a tough job. We are so grateful for the extraordinary work that you do. And I don't believe that you all are recognized or thanked enough. So with that, I would like to yield back to Chairwoman Demings. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the testimony here today.
I thank the ranking member, and I know my video feed cut out earlier, but one part, a very important part of this hearing is to acknowledge the amazing job, and I hope that at least that part got through, to acknowledge the amazing job that the men and women of FEMA do every day, and we're so appreciative for their service. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight, Management, and Accountability, the gentleman from California, Mr. Currie, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I join you, Chairwoman Demings and Ranking Member Kamick, and also thanking FEMA for the good work you're doing for Americans and for others all over the world. Again, Chairwoman Demings, thank you for holding this hearing, as well as my ranking member, Mayor, and myself. And again, we're here to discuss to support FEMA's mission and are essentially the backbone of the agency. From the field operation teams and reservists who deploy to disaster sites within hours of emergency declaration, to those who work behind the scenes to administer grant funding and organize countless logistical efforts. The FEMA workforce is varied as a task force agency can be. In the last few years, FEMA has had to juggle ongoing federal responses, numerous record-breaking disasters, COVID-19, and resettlement of refugees around the world. And that doesn't capture all of what FEMA has been doing in the last few years. It is a testament to the skill and flexibility of FEMA's workforce that the agency is able to support the federal government's efforts in so many different ways, in so many different areas. Yet it can't be said that the FEMA employees haven't felt the strain of being pulled in so many directions. Your workforce, the workforce, is suffering from an increase in burnout. In recent years, also employees have left the agency at a higher number than usual. And it's important that FEMA address these rising attrition rates and prioritize. FEMA has failed to properly prioritize workforce management issues like recruitment, retention, and the agency has struggled to deal with issues of harassment and discrimination within your workforce. But in recent years, FEMA has taken significant and concrete steps to foster a more inclusive and resilient workforce. With the support of Congress in 2019, FEMA created an Office of Professional Responsibility to better investigate allegations of employee misconduct. And under the Biden administration, FEMA has renewed a focus on addressing long-term workforce challenges by increasing the availability and quality of training and educational opportunities for the emergency management community. Providing opportunities for advancement and the development of new skills is important to retaining the agency's skilled workforce. Yet we have much work to be done. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about what they would like to see FEMA do and demonstrate an ongoing commitment to supporting its employees, as well as how we in Congress can assist you in this effort. It's not your job, it's not our job, it's the job of all of us collectively working together. We can all too easily get caught up in the immediacy of responding to the next big hurricane, wildfire, or tornado. But without doing the consistent and meaningful work to listen and respond to the needs of FEMA on a continuous basis, the agency puts in jeopardy its ability to effectively carry out its mission. Look forward to taking time today to examine these issues, to celebrate the accomplishments of your tremendous workforce, and to look ahead at the next step FEMA must take to support its fine people. And with that, I thank you again for joining us today. And Madam Chair, I yield.
Thank you so much, Mr. Correa, for that statement and for yielding back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Oversight, Management, and Accountability, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Meyer, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Demings, Ranking Member Kamick, and Chairman Correa for holding this hearing today, the first for both subcommittees in 2022. And thank you to our witnesses for giving us their time and insights into this critical and timely topic. I certainly appreciate the work that GAO and RAND have done to improve FEMA's functions, and the focus of today's hearing, how we can help build that workforce which is ready to respond and help FEMA fulfill its mission of helping people before, during, and after disasters. We will hear about the issues FEMA's workforce has faced in the past and how FEMA has worked to resolve those problems. But most importantly, I hope we will hear how FEMA can help set itself up for success in the future. Before we begin, I would like to express, as both Chairwoman and Chairman Correa have said, and also Ranking Member Kamick have said, express my sincere gratitude to the brave men and women working tirelessly at FEMA who have barely had a break since the historic hurricane season of 2017. Just last week, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association stated that the U.S. has experienced $750 billion in damages from weather-related disasters just in the last 5 years. Moreover, in 2020 and in 2021, the U.S. suffered from at least 20 individual disasters costing more than $1 billion each. The magnitude of those numbers is overwhelming and certainly speaks to the pressure that FEMA has been under. What is truly concerning is that the weather disasters are only a portion of what FEMA has been dealing with in the past several years. FEMA has also been at the forefront of the COVID-19 pandemic response for almost 2 years now. And for the first time in history, FEMA is managing a disaster declaration in every state and territory in the nation, as well as the District of Columbia. FEMA has been tasked with assisting in the coordination of the resettlement of Afghan allies through Operation Allies Welcome, as well as assisting in the border crisis on our southern border. The mission at FEMA seems to expand every few months, and I can only imagine the stress and strain that this has put on the workforce. So again, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks and appreciation to the staff at FEMA for all the good work that they do day in and day out. Because when they are called into action, it's because the event is so catastrophic that local and state resources are overwhelmed. They're the last line of defense and recovery. America deserves and needs a strong FEMA, one that can fulfill its mission every time it's called upon, because the American people expect this. And as members of Congress, we should also expect a well-managed organization that can fulfill its mission. Several studies have made recommendations over the years on how FEMA should recruit, train, and manage this workforce. And I know we'll hear about some of those today, as well as from Mr. Fugate, a former FEMA administrator who has firsthand knowledge about managing the FEMA workforce. Some recent GAO recommendations have been made to address these workforce challenges, including that the FEMA administrator should develop a plan to address identified challenges, develop mechanisms, including collecting relevant data, create a staff development program for FEMA's workforce, and FEMA has agreed to implement, or working to implement these recommendations and concurs with the conclusion. I hope that at a future date, we will be able to hear directly from FEMA on this matter. And I also look forward to RAND's input on the survey they did with FEMA to estimate the prevalence of workplace harassment and discrimination in order to strengthen the core of the employment base. I'm encouraged by FEMA's willingness to be open-minded and listen to outside groups about ways to reduce harassment and discrimination while also strengthening its workforce, both in terms of its mission and its internal culture. Because again, FEMA plays a critical role in helping our citizens and communities prepare for and respond to disasters of all kinds, and a strong workforce is essential to carrying out this mission. I know we will do everything that we can to ensure that FEMA's workforce is strong, equipped, and ready, and look forward to hearing from our witnesses. And with that, I yield back.
The chair thanks the ranking member for his statement. Members are reminded that the committees will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in their February 3rd colloquy regarding remote procedures. Without objection, members not on the subcommittees shall be permitted to sit and question the witnesses. I now welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is former FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate. Mr. Fugate served as FEMA administration throughout the Obama administration. During his tenure, he led FEMA through multiple record-breaking disaster years and oversaw the federal government's response to multiple natural disasters, including devastating tornadoes in the Midwest and hurricanes Irene, Matthew, and Sandy, among others. Prior to his time in the Obama administration, Mr. Fugate was the director of Florida's Division of Emergency Management. During his time in Florida, he launched the largest mutual aid response to affected states in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. It is great to see you, and thank you for joining us today. Our second witness is Chris Currie, the director of GAO's Homeland Security and Justice Team. Mr. Currie leads GAO's work on emergency management, disaster response and recovery, and Department of Homeland Security management and high-risk issues. Mr. Currie began his tenure with GAO in 2002. It's great to see you and welcome. Our third and final witness is Corey Sims, a senior behavioral and social scientist at the RAND Corporation. Ms. Sims' current and past research includes investigating the effects of workplace stressors on job attitudes and performance, exploring the effects of organizational climate and culture on job attitudes and behavior, and how best to change organizational climate and culture, and determining the knowledge, skills, and abilities required for success in various military and civilian jobs. Welcome, Ms. Sims, and thank you so much for joining us today. Without objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize their statement for 5 minutes, beginning with former Administrator Fugate.
Well, thank you, Chair and Ranking Member, and the other Chair and Ranking Members. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the fact, the thanks you gave FEMA, because I remember not too long ago in the distant past where FEMA wasn't held in high regard. The aftermath of Hurricane Katrina was a stain for the agency. And as much as we're talking about the challenges FEMA is facing, I also like to acknowledge how far FEMA has come from that response and the improvements they have made. A lot of it with the support of Congress. And you asked an important question. What can Congress do to help FEMA develop and professionalize and continue to grow the workforce? And I want to address a couple of key issues because I think it's easy to state the problems. And quite honestly, a lot of what's been discussed is process. It will not change the outcome. You can do all the studies, gather all the data, do all the reviews, and it still won't change the fundamental process that FEMA depends upon a workforce that is not what many people think it is. We use the term reservists, but FEMA employees that are hired as reservists are considered intermittent employees. They're only employed when there's a disaster. They have no benefits when they're not, and they're on call. Now think about the current workforce that we are facing in the nation with job shortages. How do you attract qualified people, train them, have them sit waiting in case there is a disaster, then deploy them and expect to have that kind of output with no other benefits or retentions outside of their initial training? Now, again, FEMA has a lot of disasters. Some folks are called up and are routinely deployed for long periods of time, but other more specialized skills are only deployed rarely. There's also the tendency to go to the same people over and over again because they have more experience. Newer people hired don't get the training, don't have the experience, and don't always get called up. So the first thing I would ask Congress to look at is, how do you maintain a workforce? And this is the majority of the folks that deploy in disasters are the reservists that do the bulk of the work in recovery. How do you maintain on-call, qualified, trained staff that are only engaged when you deploy them to a disaster and have no other benefits? Even in the military, and again, we use the term reservists, these are not the same type of benefits the reservists have in the U.S. military, where they are covered under the Uniform Services Employment and Reemployment Act, where if people have jobs and get called up for military duty, those jobs are protected. That doesn't even apply to the FEMA reservists. Reservists have a known deployment of every month. They have drill, they get reimbursed for that. They have 2 weeks annual training, again, subject to any call-ups for the federal mission, protection for the deployment. FEMA reservists get none of that. So I think the first thing we want to look at is, can we give FEMA more tools in recruiting and retaining qualified reservists, that many of which only are going to deploy in certain types of disasters or certain skill sets, and address how do you incentivize people who would be available. Also understand that some of these folks work full time. They can't wait for a disaster. But they may have skills that are required by FEMA. Is there a way to provide tools there? And so I would look at reservists and think about this. These are literally up to thousands to tens of thousands of people that we are deploying across this nation. They're on call. They're totally subject to FEMA's needs. They are not incentivized when they're not deployed. They really don't get any benefits outside of when they're deployed. And that model doesn't scale up to the frequency of disasters, nor does it work very good when the economy is strong because of the shortfall in employees. The second thing I would look at is the work that they're doing. Much has been made, and I think this, you'll hear this across the board. is a concern that will FEMA be able to respond to the next disaster? And I can tell you the answer. The answer is yes, they will respond. That's not been the issue. The issue has been having to take people off of previous disasters where recovery work can take years, if not decades, and move them to the new disaster, stopping or slowing down the recovery from the previous disasters. And I asked this question, and I've had conversations with my counterparts at JO and others, is our reimbursement process and rebuilding process takes literally New Orleans. We're still doing recovery from Katrina. I was still doing recovery when I left FEMA at Katrina. Why does it take us a decade when insurance companies are in and out in less than a year? And I think we need to go back and say, instead of working always on the workforce, we need to work on the process of how do we speed up the process of reimbursing communities. And this may not be a shock to you, but too often decisions on how to process disasters are made based upon what I hear in a lot of hearings we start out with to avoid fraud, waste, and abuse, becoming the overriding decision maker that nobody wants to take a risk of an adverse finding in a IG report or GAO report. And so we have such a high requirement that we have built processes to minimize that at the expense of helping communities recover quickly and requiring a workforce that is extremely large. Think about it. I will almost guarantee you the tornado outbreaks we saw earlier around Christmas in Kentucky and the other regions, the insurance companies will done within a year. FEMA will be there for the next 5 years. Why? If we don't fix the process, you're always going to need a lot more people to administer this. And so 2 ways to check this is give them better benefits to recruit them and look at how do we reduce the process so it takes fewer people to be successful in helping communities recover faster and get the money there in the first year of recovery, not 5 years later while we're still trying to make sure the answer is perfect. Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to have to interrupt you, but the time has expired. We've gone a little bit well over, and I would ask that during one of the questions, if there's additional information that you would please present it at that time, because you have such a great perspective. I do also need to remind members that votes have been called. I know that members have been leaving. We are going to continue through. So if you have not voted yet, please go ahead and vote, and we're going to continue with the hearing. Thank you so much for your indulgence. I now recognize Mr. Currie to summarize his statement for 5 minutes. Mr. Currie.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Demings, Chairman Correa, Ranking Members Kamek and Meyer. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss our work on FEMA's workforce over the years. I'd also like to say that I have a deep respect for the men and women at FEMA. I've worked with them for many years. They work long hours, thankless jobs. They're away from home long periods of time. Also, many of them are also veterans and have joined FEMA to continue their service to the country. So the findings of our work have nothing to do with the dedication and hard work of FEMA, but more about how the agency manages its people and how I think that could get better. And I agree with Mr. Fugate. I mean, I think it's both. I think there's certainly areas within FEMA that can be improved and better managed, but I agree we need to look at some long-term reform efforts, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But today, there's never been more pressure on the FEMA workforce, and they're tired. In recent years, disasters have not just increased, but they're often sequential. There's no downtime. There's no disaster season anymore. It's all year long. This requires FEMA's workforce to deploy from one place to another after another. And then add to that because of FEMA's capabilities, they've had to help with the pandemic response, not just help, but lead the response, assist CBP at the border, and help resettle Afghan refugees. So FEMA's asked to do these things because they have the resources, they have the authorities and the logistical abilities that many other federal agencies don't have. However, they've taken on all these responsibilities with a workforce structure and staffing process that hasn't transformed to keep up with this pace of what they're expected to do today. The existing workforce models were designed to scale up during a past time long ago when disasters and large disasters were rare. So our work, I'll talk a little bit about our work, and then I'll talk about, I think, some of the things we need to do moving forward. But our work has been stated, has identified a number of challenges internally that I think are going to get worse if they're not addressed over time. For example, FEMA has long faced challenges in deploying staff with the right qualifications and skills to meet the disaster needs. So This is not just us, but we talked to FEMA leaders. We talked to federal coordinating officers, field people, people on the ground. They told us that the agency's qualification system, which is critical deploying the right people, doesn't effectively capture staff qualifications and often leads to unqualified or untrained people being deployed to disasters. This causes problems, and I think this needs to be fixed. We also found that FEMA struggles to train, coach, and develop its workforce. It's particularly its incident management workforce, especially when deployed in the field. Field leaders told us they struggle to get the training and development necessary to be effective. For example, reservists who make up 35 to 40% of FEMA's workforce, they have problems accessing developmental opportunities when they're not deployed. And this gets to some of the structural reforms Mr. Fugate talked about. For example, getting paid time and technology to train when they're deployed is very difficult because of the way they have to be paid through a specific disaster. So what we recommended is that they, and this has been talked about already, they develop a more specific developmental program that addresses a lot of these challenges, where we can do this outside of some of these deployments too. The other thing I'd like to mention is FEMA's hired thousands of new employees in recent years. According to the data I've seen, they've increased their total force by over 5,000 people in the last 6 years. They now have over 22,000 staff ready to respond. Additional staff are fantastic given their increased workload, but it's not the only solution to this. They're likely to make some of these training and qualification challenges even more difficult. For example, this means that less experienced staff are likely to be staffed to a number of these disasters. So this is going to be something that we have to continue to address. So I think, as I mentioned, the problem is a little bit more complicated than just tweaking internal process. I think FEMA and the Congress should consider two larger areas. And some of this is going to align with what Mr. Fugate said. First, we need to consider a broader workforce reform effort involving Congress and potential legislation. New authorities may be necessary to address some of these issues. For example, the restriction on training reserve employees and paying for training and development when they're not actually deployed to a disaster. The way that works now is a large part of the incident management workforce is being trained when they're deployed to a disaster. This is great real life experience, but it often means that training is not going to be a priority, not surprisingly. Second, we need to look at the process, I agree, and workload we're asking FEMA staff to perform. While most folks, I think of FEMA staff as immediately responding to a disaster with the blue jackets on, with FEMA on the back. The truth is that much of FEMA's workforce manages grants and money and recovery efforts from prior disasters. There are many disasters that stay open for 5 to 10 years or 15 years or 16 years in the case of Hurricane Katrina. FEMA told us last year that they were managing almost 1,000 prior disasters that were still in some stage of recovery. So this means we're still cutting checks from disasters that happened 15 years ago, as Mr. Fugate mentioned about Hurricane Katrina. So the bottom line is that streamlining existing programs to be more efficient would also help cut down on FEMA's workload and help them focus on the things we think they need to be focused on. This completes my statement today, and I look forward to discussing how we can address the challenges and your questions.
Thank you so much for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Ms. Sims to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Chairwoman, ranking members of the subcommittees, for allowing me to testify today. I am a principal investigator and author of a study published in December 2020 on the prevalence and characteristics of civil rights violations at FEMA. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of this study. Next, I will share some results. And finally, I will highlight some of our recommendations. In 2018, FEMA executed an internal investigation into sexual harassment and misconduct in its senior leadership ranks. Unlike most organizations confronted with these issues, FEMA leaders chose to openly discuss and address the problems. As part of that, they reached out to us to provide an independent and objective assessment across the organization of both the overall prevalence and characteristics of harassment and discrimination at FEMA. Working with FEMA, we decided to focus on 2 classes of civil rights violation that we and they thought were likely to be most common. First, harassment and discrimination on the basis of sex and gender, and second, harassment and discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity. I use the term civil rights violation to apply to both. Now I will review three main findings, though you can find more detailed results in the written testimony and of course in the written report. First, we found civil rights violations affected many employees in the FEMA workforce, with almost a third of employees categorized as having experienced at least one gender-based or race ethnicity-based civil rights violation in the previous year. Women were more likely to experience these than were men, and groups such as African American employees experienced these more frequently as well. Rates of civil rights violations varied across offices, as you can see in Figure 2 of my written testimony. Second, we also examined perceptions of both key leadership behaviors that play a critical role in overall workplace climate for gender-based and race ethnicity-based harassment, as well as looking at climate for general workplace incivility. As an example of a key leadership behavior, it is a legal requirement that supervisors forward reports to them to an appropriate authority. However, about a quarter of women were not sure that their supervisors would report sexual harassment to the right FEMA authority. About a quarter of African American employees felt similarly with regard to how their supervisors would handle a racial ethnic harassment complaint. About 40% of women and African American employees expressed similar sentiments about FEMA senior leaders. In general, men had more positive perceptions of the work environment at FEMA than women did. And in addition, white and Hispanic employees had more positive perceptions of the work environment than did African American employees. This suggests FEMA employees perceive discrepancies in the leadership enforcement of workplace norms for professional behavior. Third, employees' concerns are also reflected in the actions that employees took after experiencing a civil rights violation. FEMA employees did not always report the incident, not to an official channel. Top barriers to reporting included that the employee did not think anything would be done, and they wanted to forget about it and move on. Most FEMA employees who reported discrimination were not satisfied with FEMA's response, possibly due to the actions taken or not. In fact, about 40% of those having reported discrimination were encouraged to just drop the issue. Of those who reported harassment, a quarter or more indicated having been subject to some form of retaliation, which is itself illegal, as did more than a third who reported discrimination. If FEMA employees are to trust the system through which they must report these negative workplace experiences, then accountability and transparency at all levels of leadership is essential. Finally, I will discuss a few of our recommendations. We suggested FEMA explore differences in climate between offices that had low and high rates of civil rights violations. We also suggested they increase accountability and transparency in dealing with violations and ensure that leaders at all levels understand how best to do so. And we suggested they continue monitoring harassment and discrimination in the workforce. Evidence that harassment and discrimination exist within their walls is unwelcome to organizations unwilling to do the work to improve their workplace environments for their employees. FEMA is the only organization, to our knowledge, to confront such evidence voluntarily and publicly. This effort offers the opportunity to move the evidence-based needle, not just for FEMA, but also more broadly for other organizations on appropriate interventions to reduce and prevent harassment and discrimination. Congressional support for such efforts is critical. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today about this important subject. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for your testimony. And thank you to all of the witnesses. I will remind the subcommittees that we will each have 5 minutes to question the panel. I will now recognize myself for questions, and I appreciate the panel's indulgence as we are in the middle of votes. This question is for all of you. FEMA's workforce has supported the federal government's response to a growing number of obligations, including numerous record-breaking disasters, Operation Allies Welcome, and the COVID-19 response. Just last week, FEMA was tasked with additional responsibilities in the ongoing fight against COVID-19, including creating new testing sites and assessing national hospital bed capacity. FEMA's ever-increasing workload has caused a significant strain on the workforce, resulting in employees leaving the agency at increased rates. What would you say FEMA can do or Congress can do to help prevent burnout in the workforce? And Mr. Fugate, I'll start with you.
Well, part of the question is, with all of these other things coming in, is this really FEMA's job? And my answer is yes. You created FEMA not just to respond to natural hazards. FEMA was created to respond to disasters that require the capabilities that FEMA has been blessed with the funding and capabilities that you've given them. So the question is, should you take things away from FEMA? I think that's the wrong answer. I think the better answer is, how do we make sure FEMA has the workforce required to do this? They lean heavily on the ability to fund out of the Stafford Act, the reservists and their core, which are their full-time, not permanent employees that are termed employees that they use in disaster response. But I would also go back and look at your career base. FEMA has not substantially grown since Hurricane Katrina, yet the workload has been growing quite rapidly. And so it's always a touchy issue when you talk about growing the workforce. You need more people. Reality is FEMA is going to need to look at staffing requirements going forward with the mission sets and frequency of disasters in the career workforce. Balance that with the funding from the Stafford Act employees that are the core and the reservists, and making the reservists more practical as a retention function. Again, going back to the benefits, and as the GAO pointed out, and I tried to do this and found out I couldn't do this, is how do you train them when they're not deployed to a disaster? Because they're paid by disaster, not out of a general fund that can be used for all of those employees.
Thank you so much, Mr. Currie.
I agree. I mean, I agree with a lot of what's been said, but I think it actually, some of this is a good thing for FEMA because they're reliable. The reason they get asked to do so much is because they have the authority, the funding, the relationships at the state and local level to execute logistics, like in the pandemic response. Next to the military, there's nobody better. And so in many ways, it's a good thing because it means their response function is working pretty well. But I think the bottom line is that the workforce structure has not been transformed and evolved to fit what we're asking them to do right now. But I also think there's multiple sides of this. I mean, there's the hiring and the flexibilities piece of like, what do we need? And then how do we get what we need and how does it need to function? But internally too, you mentioned the retention issue. It's just as important that, if we're going to hire 6,000 people in the last few years like they had, the internal functioning better work pretty well too, or else you're not going to retain these people. It doesn't matter if you hire 6,000 people if you lose 3,000 of them. So I think we have to look at all of it. That's why I think there needs to be a more holistic transformation effort looked at in this regard and figure out, what maybe legislative changes might be needed. What can FEMA do on its own? Maybe there are special authorities similar to what has been done in the past with the National Guard or the military reserves that can be done to help some of these training and deployment challenges that we've faced. So I think that it's got to be a multifaceted approach.
Ms. Sims? Ms. Sims.
Hi, I'll agree to the holistic approach. I had a pretty specific study, but making sure the back end harassment and discrimination have been linked to retention. So, alleviating these kinds of workplace challenges also helps keep your workforce intact. And I see we're running out of time, so.
Thank you all so much. I will now go to the gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Miller Meeks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Demings. This is a question for Mr. Fugate and Mr. Currie from responding to disasters and the COVID-19 pandemic to assisting with UACs along the border and assisting in the resettlement of Afghan refugees, FEMA has a number of competing priorities. How are these competing and added responsibilities affecting the FEMA workforce?
Ma'am, I'll start first. Again, when you look at all the things that FEMA's doing, the one that takes the most people is responding to disasters, and that's the bulk of the workforce. What FEMA's doing in the coordination of the COVID is less about deploying people, but using headquarters and regional functions to coordinate that and coordinate other agency staff. FEMA's not actually sending their people in the hospitals. They're coordinating HHS and other resources on behalf of the governors, and that's something they're built and set up to do. And again, when I was in FEMA, we dealt with the southwest border. We were given the mission by the White House to do the unaccompanied children. It was a skill set we had because it was mass care, taking care of children. So while those seem to be very large operations, it turned out that in an organization of almost 20,000, what you'll find is it's a task, but it's not overwhelming. The bulk of the large force of FEMA is actually tied up in responding to, and more importantly, it was pointed out, is the recovery from disasters for years.
Mr.
Thank,
Currie?
sure, thank you. And if I remember right from talking to you before, I believe you come from a public health background, right? So I will use the COVID example with FEMA. So something that was never envisioned 3 or 4 years ago with a pandemic like this is that we'd have almost 60 federally declared disasters across the states, territories, tribes for a public health emergency. So just in that alone, FEMA is processing. I don't have an exact number, but the last one I've seen is well over 30, maybe 40,000 grantees for the pandemic just on grant reimbursements alone for PPE, COVID costs, schools, you name it. So you add that on top of what I said before, which is like almost 1,000 prior disaster recovery declarations where they're still processing public assistance claims, the grants. It's that alone is just astronomical. I actually don't think the Afghan and the border tasking, that's more the response side of the house. They deploy quickly, they use their resources, they get out. I think what we see is this long tail on recovery and processing projects. And by the way, this is probably what you hear most frustration about at the state and local level is, where's my grant money? Where's my reimbursements? Why are we fighting over this? But this is what the majority of the workload there is dealing with. And I don't think there's a clear understanding, as Mr. Fugate said this up front, that what they're actually doing outside of just the immediate response is not quite, I think, what people think.
Yeah, and I thank you for that. And you're correct, Mr. Currie. I'm a physician, military veteran, and I do come from a public health background as a state director. And I found it unusual to have put FEMA in charge of vaccine and vaccine clinics. They don't have medical personnel. And I can tell you my local public health agencies with whom I'm in contact with, and I did vaccine clinics in all 24 counties, they have the wherewithal and the knowledge to have been able to have done that and to done that effectively without increased burden and cost to FEMA. I also find it interesting, and I'm not sure how you all feel about it, but in processing, when I went to Quantico and learned about the processing of Afghan refugees, all of the Afghan refugees get vaccinations for all childhood immunizations. They are COVID-19 tested, and then they're offered COVID-19 vaccine, but it's not mandatory. But yet on our southern border, as you're processing and being required to help process people on the southern border, there is no COVID-19 testing. So I'm not sure if you feel that puts, like the CBP, they feel that they're put at risk, that your agents are also put at risk in helping to manage those coming in our country, either through Afghanistan or through the southern border. That's okay. You don't need to respond. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight, Management, and Accountability, the gentleman from California, Mr. Currie, for 5
Madam
minutes.
Chair, thank you very much. And I want to thank our witnesses, some excellent presentations. I think of FEMA, I think of other government agencies, Spirit the Corps, just serving because they believe in the mission, they believe in service to our country, they believe in saving people, rescuing people in the most dark time of crisis. And they're veterans. You have a lot of veterans that join FEMA. You have a lot of service corps individuals. So you have I would say, a very envious workforce that are there because they believe. So given the challenges that you have, which you're overextended, multi-missioned, sometimes you get controversy. Again, I just heard a minute ago that the locals just want to get their grants and please move on. But if you got a worker, he or she, coming in there with the best intentions, then they experience civil right violations, sexual harassment. It kind of makes things a little difficult. So my question, and this is a general one for all of you, you can be brief in your answer, given that we have a few moments here. What can we do to assure those individuals that are victimized that once they, essentially blow the whistle and turn somebody over, how can we make sure that those violators, those offenders are held accountable for their action? How can give the incentive to let folks know if somebody wrongs you, this great gold-plated FEMA agency, we're going to take care of them. Thank you.
Well, this is Craig. I think you really need to ask this of FEMA Administrator Criswell, because I think she's taken the RAND studies, she's implemented an action plan. She's doing things that I think get to your issue. They're publishing in their weekly newsletter to their employees those sexual harassment cases that are being disciplined. That's never been done before. And again, I think they're trying to bring a level of transparency that's never been done before. And this won't be cured overnight, but the steps they're taking are concrete. And they've asked RAND to come back and do multiple surveys, not just do one and done, but to see if the steps they are taking is changing that culture so they can continue that feedback loop of making sure that when you come to FEMA, you're there to do your job, not deal with, as you point out, sir, the other issues, the harassment, the just a lot of stuff that's just not tolerated in the organization. And I think the administrators made that clear from her first day. Her approach to that's going to be very hands-on and very transparent.
Thank you.
And based on on the recommendations from our study, we did say increase accountability and transparency and make sure leadership at all levels, including those who are deployed, as we've heard, may not have the training that they need necessarily to begin to start. Make sure they have the training so that they know how to handle these kinds of things so that they can address them when they happen. And FEMA, I do think, is doing a rolling out the plan and implementing it over time. And that's what it will take. It's simple, but it's not easy. It's something that will take a while.
Usually the simplest solutions are the toughest ones to implement. They're usually the most effective. Mr. Currie?
Yeah, this requires cultural change, which takes time, but there are building blocks to cultural change. And I mean, I've been encouraged to see some of the things that have happened recently. I agree that the way you solve this is not by burying it. They've been very transparent, very open, which is a very humble approach to this, which is necessary. But there's also very specific EEOC best practices that we've seen across government that are done. For instance, they set up the Office of Professional Responsibility, which reports to the administrator. They are neutral. They're sort of a third party within the agency. That was done to set up transparency and legitimacy to these harassment reviews, so people don't see them as influenced by other managers. So there's lots of pieces to this. I think they're doing all the right things. We're just, we're looking at it right now, and I think we're just going to have to see what the impact of this is, year 1 or 2 after these changes have been made.
And let me just add that I think you're right. It is a cultural, societal issue. It's not only one at FEMA, but I think society as a whole, we're trying to get there. So all of us are working together. But again, our offer, as the chair has said, if you need any help from us legislatively, please let us know. Thank you very much. And Madam Chair, with that, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, for 5 minutes.
Am I muted?
We can hear you. Mr. Payne?
Is that better? There we go.
Yes, we can hear
Okay,
you.
thank you. Morning, Mr. Fugate. It's good to see you again. Been a little while. Let's see. In 2020, GAO released a report that discussed FEMA's staffing shortages in 2017 and 2018, a period when multiple hurricanes made landfall in less than a month. At the time, FEMA had to redeploy personnel from one disaster to the next. Mr. Fugate, Mr. Currie, what impact do these redeployments and lack of staffing have on FEMA's ability to carry out its mission? And what impact does this have on employee morale and performance?
Well, I'll start, and it's good to see you, Congressman. When you looked at what FEMA had to do in 2017 with the three major hurricanes, and again in 18, I was very familiar with that all the way back in Florida, where I got hit by 4 hurricanes in one season. And so I know this from the local and state perspective as well as the federal perspective. You're always going to go and focus on the immediate response, life safety, the needs of the public, the individual assistance programs. Those get the highest priority, which means you're going to pull people from the recovery. And so what it does is it delays communities from recovering. It delays the funding that FEMA provides for communities to rebuild. It results in local governments and states having to borrow money because they can't get reimbursed fast enough. I know in Florida, I talked to officials from Monroe County that were having to borrow money to pay for Hurricane Irma response because it took too long to reimburse for debris. So it really is FEMA taking what they have. It's always focused on life safety, the individual assistance, immediate response at the expense of the recovery, which both cost the local communities, but ultimately the federal taxpayer more money in overhead, administrative costs, mistakes, and delays in recovery.
And the morale?
You know, again, I think the morale piece is when you can't get breaks, when you're just doing serial response and the same people are getting called out. I think that's one of the things Administrator Criswell on her first day when she talked to folks and said, look, we're busy, but when we can get downtime, I want people to take some downtime. We don't have to be at work every day if you have that ability. Problem is disasters dictate that. Another interesting thing is what I found with FEMA, this was kind of a number I was always fascinated with. We lost more people in the first 3 years of their employment at FEMA than in any other time frame. And I think a lot of it came about because they were there for the response phase. They didn't necessarily realize they had signed up for a grant phase of long-term recovery, of sitting in offices processing paperwork. That wasn't what they thought they were signing up for. So I think
Gotcha.
that's another challenge they face.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Currie?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just about numbers, Congressman Payne. I mean, if it was just about numbers, I think they'd be doing pretty well. You know, they've hired 6,000 people over the last 5 years. They've got 22,000 people sort of on staff. But I think there's a misconception that they're just all those people are waiting around for a disaster to happen, then they deploy everyone. The truth is that most of that workforce is already committed to something else. One of those prior 1,000 disaster recoveries that's still going on. So at any given time, they might have 30 to 40% of their workforce actually able to be deployed when something actually happens. So it's not just things that are going to happen in the future. It's all the cumulative things that are still going on from the past. And then you add on that what happened like in 2017 when you had 3 sequential hurricanes and the huge wildfires in the West, then you're overwhelmed because you really only started with having 30 to 40% of your workforce available. So I think we've got to figure something out where, we are able to scale up for those kind of situations in a much better way. And I think it's the process issue of like, what are all those people working on from past disaster recoveries, the grants, the paperwork? There's got to be a way to streamline that so we can focus folks on what we want them to really be focused on.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I will yield back. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The gentleman yields back. I'm going to recognize myself for additional questions Um, Mr. Curry, after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in 2017, one reason for the delays in disaster assistance was an insufficient number of bilingual FEMA employees. FEMA's guidance required all communications to be in Spanish, yet the agency did not have enough emergency responders who could meet the requirement. So could you talk a little bit, and I know everybody probably can clearly understand how important the cultural competency is to having an appropriate response, but just talk about some of the challenges in recruiting a bilingual workforce.
It's a great question, and the situation in Puerto Rico was so extreme, just because of the bilingual needs there and the size of that disaster. So there's no doubt they didn't have the capacity they needed to handle something like that when it happened. One of the things FEMA does is they try to hire locally under the Stafford Act to address these challenges when they come up, and they did that in Puerto Rico. They hired thousands of local folks, for these missions, and that's great to address this need. But the other challenge is that these folks have no experience with FEMA programs or, in some cases, emergency management. There's ways to try to address this challenge to help the linguistics issue, but it's also hard to just have a workforce kind of sitting around ready for any contingency that might happen. In this country, we have so many languages spoken. So depending on where the disaster hits, it's really difficult to do that. So again, it's this issue of, are we ready to scale up or scale down when this is needed? And there may be other things to look at besides only hiring folks that speak Spanish or other languages. Maybe there's other resources they can bring in from other agencies or partnerships where they can scale up when's necessary.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And you're correct. There are so many languages in our country, which is a beautiful thing. But I do think that Spanish is one of those prevalent languages in our country. Mr. Fugate, anything you'd like to add to that?
Again, in Florida, we face language issues. It's not only Spanish. We have Creole languages. And in New York City, when we were dealing with Superstorm Sandy, we had literally dozens of major languages that we were having to do. And so again, what Gio said is we would hire local people to act as translators. It gives us several things. One, they know the communities, they know the neighborhoods, they know a lot of the underlying issues. And I think this is why a big part of what I pushed at FEMA was always hire local and buy local as much as you can to help the local economy. I wouldn't expect the new hires in Puerto Rico to run the programs. What I would expect them to do is to be partnered with somebody at FEMA who knew the programs, to then integrate that with the local officials, act as the translators, but also give them a better understanding of the context of what they're dealing with. I've always found that local people understand issues in a way that somebody coming from outside of that community just never grasps. And so that's why I put a big premium, but it's got to be done in a way that gets subject matter experts tied with that local hire to be effective. It can't just be I hired a local person and turn them loose and expect the programs to be administered.
Do either of you know of any adjustments that were made? And Mr. Curry, you're absolutely correct. Puerto Rico did provide some unique challenges. I had an opportunity to visit the island in 2017 with a congressional delegation. Were there once you experience the challenges in terms of the language barriers, the lack of bilingual employees, were there any adjustments that were made or recommendations that were made to prepare for the next time?
Yeah, and I too, I've been there 5 times since Hurricane Maria as well, and gotten to understand the situation pretty well. And I think the bottom line is right now, I think they're really well prepared for something else is going to happen because they have so many people they've hired locally, and a lot of those people have converted over to full-time or reserve or core positions and gone to other parts of the country or stayed there in Puerto Rico, are now managing the program, and they have the experience. So I think their capacity level is really high in terms of preparedness to deal with something else. Now, honestly, it's taken 4 years to get there. It was a struggle, and it was not pretty the first couple years. It's gotten better. So I think they're in pretty good shape to handle, response to disasters that may happen. I think the challenge in Puerto Rico has more to do with the financial situation of the recovery and the funding that's necessary to rebuild all the damaged infrastructure, because they haven't even really, you know, started to tackle the long-term projects yet. And a lot of that has to do with the financial condition of Puerto Rico.
Thank you so much for that. Ms. Sims, anything at all that you would like to add to this particular question?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Fugate, last year, the union that represents FEMA, the American Federation of Government Employees, sent a letter to the incoming FEMA administrator, which highlighted that the FEMA workforce were comprised of only 5,000 full-time employees out of 26,000 roughly total employees. Over the past few years, we have witnessed numerous disasters, including hurricanes, floods, fires, tornadoes, and of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. With year-round disasters, we need year-round employees who can respond to those disasters. Could you talk a little bit, would it benefit or how would it benefit FEMA to change the composition of its workforce to hire more permanent full-time employees? Or do you believe that there should be a significant contingency of part-time employees as well to be able to fulfill the mission?
I think you're going to have all of that, but the ratios are wrong. I think you need to go back to originally FEMA deployed permanent workforce as the primary disaster responders. The problem was they were staying out so long, the other work wasn't getting done. And that really created this move towards almost all disasters being handled by the non-permanent workforce, with the permanent workforce not deploying. When I got to FEMA, it turned out there was people in the permanent workforce that didn't even have emergency functions in their position descriptions and legally couldn't be deployed against their will. Even though FEMA requires every employee to, as now, to do that, when I got there, even though the statement said you're available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week deployed, the vast majority of FEMA staff had never been deployed, weren't allowed to deploy, or it wasn't in their position description. We changed that, but I think it is important that people that, in my experience was when the FEMA folks deployed the permanent workforce, it not only gave us additional personnel in the field, it was more important to overall FEMA's mission because they got to see the things they're administrating at headquarters in the field and understand what the challenges were. And it made them better, including what was interesting was our grants people. As you pointed out, all the funding that FEMA provides to the grants program, the Homeland Security grants and the funding there to help build preparedness. It was amazing that the grants people had never seen the outcome of their work. And when they went to Superstorm Sandy, they saw all that equipment, all that capability for the first time deployed. And they're going, I never realized we had that big of an impact. I said, that response wouldn't have occurred without the funding you administered. So I think the permanent workforce needs to be part of disaster response. It needs to be built into their DNA. We must be able to continue the existing work. So I think we need to grow that permanent workforce. We need to make it where they do deploy more frequently so they have that connection between their mission and what's done in the field. But also balance that with there's no way to have that big of a workforce that may not have a lot of disasters to go to, using the core and the reserve workforce to be a balanced response. So we have surge workforce capabilities, but we also are not excluding the permanent workforce from being part of the disaster response team.
You know, Mr. Fugate, I was hoping that the chair of the full committee was going to be able to join us today. He is not. So the question is, when you testified before the committee in October of 2015, Chairman Thompson asked whether our disaster response workforce was as robust as it would need to be to respond to a disaster on the scale of Hurricane Katrina, as we talk about workforce numbers. At the time, you told the committee that we're not there. In 2019, Chairman Thompson asked then FEMA Administrator Gaynor a similar question, and he responded that FEMA had a deficient of a few thousand. We keep hearing time and time again that FEMA does not have enough staff, and we've also talked about some of the challenges for that. What do we need to do, or how can we help FEMA to be better able to recruit? And sometimes that's the easy part, but to retain more employees.
Well, my experience tells me that people that are attracted to FEMA, who don't really understand FEMA, are attracted to what they see as the response role. And it turns out the response role is one of the things that most people at FEMA and the permanent full-time jobs do the least of. So there's often a mismatch between expectations and reality. I think we need to do a better job of doing that, but also think we need to provide to the permanent workforce more opportunities to be in disaster response without necessarily taking away from the day-to-day mission, which means better staff, and more flexibility there. But I think the last piece goes back to the reserve workforce. If we expect to have well-trained quality folks, we have to do something besides only dealing with it when we employ them in a disaster. So I think, and this is something that Congress needs to look at. Provide FEMA the authority to use Stafford Act funds to train reservists not tied to a disaster, so that they get minimal training on a reoccurring basis to improve retention and make better trained reservists before they're deployed. And also look at other incentives that the military reserve has to protect those people who may come off of existing jobs to help in disasters, so that we can attract the best quality folks, best retention, and good benefits. But I think just one thing, if you just got the Stafford Act amended where FEMA could train reservists not tied to a disaster response, but out of what they generally refer to as the DSR surge account, so that it would be a reoccurring training, including things like harassment training, which turns out a lot of these folks don't have any of that until they show up at the job site. And then that's hard to get as a priority when you're dealing with everything you're faced in the first 30 days of a disaster. But I think this is one thing that would help clarify and give FEMA the authority to use the funding in the disaster relief fund to train reservists outside of being deployed to a specific disaster.
Thank you so much for that. I do ask unanimous consent to submit into the record a letter from the American Federation of Government Employees. So moved. Thank you, Mr. Fugate. And you spoke about harassment. Ms. Sims, the RAND's 2020 report highlights several challenges. I think we talked a little bit about those FEMA faces in the effort to create a more inclusive workforce, including barriers that can prevent employees from reporting incidents of harassment and discrimination. Can you describe just some of the barriers while conducting your survey, if there were any, with FEMA employees?
So I guess I would say having the reserve workforce as it was not necessarily a barrier, but it was a challenge, right? Because obviously they're a huge part of what FEMA does. And we definitely wanted to get their perspective, especially since there was some indication that possibly during deployments, they might experience challenges there. So, you know, it was key to get a good estimate of prevalence across the organization to be able to recruit them. Now, FEMA did help us out during the course of the survey. They sent an email through their system, their DTS system, to FEMA reservists so that they could know to check their FEMA email, because we sent the invitations with unique links to FEMA employees and emails. But it was interesting, you know, we worked with FEMA to try and get reservists paid to take the survey, because they're doing FEMA's work when they're taking the survey, right? They're helping FEMA understand what their experience was. And that was a challenge because there was no functionality in the sense of if they were paid, if they claimed that time, then FEMA would know they took the survey, and we were also trying to protect their confidentiality. So there are some tricky things there with the reserve workforce.
Okay, thank you so very much. Mr. Currie or Mr. Fugate, anything you would like to add to, you know, how we can better interact with the FEMA employees because of the large numbers and the reservist status to get the information that we need? Mr. Sims?
Ms. Sims or Mr. Currie?
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Currie.
Sorry. No, I agree. I think you can probably hear this issue of how do you pay and train your intermittent workforce is a challenge. And you know, I think the military analogy is somewhat useful. I mean, I don't want to say that system's perfect, but you know, back when the reservist and the National Guard employee flexibilities and titles were developed, it was to address this same issue. You know, how do we have our permanent military, but how do we scale up when we have a need? And that includes not just hiring people and training people, but how do you deploy them given their specific skill sets? Very similar at FEMA. I mean, I think we need a relook at this whole system. And there's been some things done. I mean, for example, the DRRA bill back in 2018 gave FEMA flexibility to more easily convert Corps and reservists to full-time positions without having to re-go through the whole federal hiring process, which is not easy. So, I mean, there's been some things around the margins, but I mean, you've got to look at this in totality, from hiring to onboarding to training to retention.
And Mr. Fugate?
Yeah, some of this is going to be require a lot of work. I think the simplest thing is and this can be done in the budget process. So as we're working on the next budget, this is really a simple fix if you can get people to agree to it. Give FEMA the authority to pay for reservists outside of being deployed to disaster. So if they already have that 2 days a month and 2 weeks a year, if they're not deployed, they get training. Then things like these surveys don't become an issue of trying to get people to take a survey, yet risk identifying them because they're getting paid. It also goes back to better retention. And this is something we can do right now. You have this in the budget process. It would be an addition to the authorizing language and the appropriations language to give FEMA the ability to do this. I don't think this would require new funding. I think you funded the disaster relief fund at adequate levels. You're going to have to do some additional adjustments based upon the level of disasters. But I don't think this is a huge challenge of new money that has to be found, new authority that has to be found. This needs to clarify that FEMA has the authority to use the relief fund to train reservists outside of a specific disaster.
Thank you so much. The chair will now recognize the gentlewoman from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so much. Mr. Currie, over the past year, FEMA has placed COVID-19 surge response teams in my district, and they've been going door to door, canvassing efforts to try to increase vaccination rates. I represent one of the most diverse districts in the country, and I wonder if you could address whether FEMA makes any attempt to send people who match the neighborhoods so that they can be more effective. And also, since the Biden administration has highlighted diversity as one of the goals for FEMA, how can you all reach out to better hire a diverse workforce that looks like the people in my community?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So based on the work that we've done evaluating FEMA, I mean, we know that they do attempt at the regional level to deploy people that have the background of that area and speak the language, if that's necessary, to try to better connect with those communities. They absolutely do that. I don't have data with me on how well they do that or any metrics, but I do know that's a priority. On the hiring side, I think at FEMA, not just at FEMA, but at DHS, I mean, they take hiring through the lens of diversity very seriously. I've seen their human capital monitoring and metrics, which, where they monitor by gender, by race, by ethnicity, by language, by veteran status, who they hire, who they retain. So there's a lot of focus on that right now. And I think even more so over the last year as the executive orders have come out about trying to promote additional diversity in the federal workforce.
But do you know if you've reached out to the historical Black colleges or minority serving institutions as part of the recruiting process?
No, ma'am, I don't know if FEMA has done that because we haven't looked at that.
Well, I think that'd be a good idea. That'd be a way to attract some bright young people and get some diversity at the same time. And speaking of young people, tell me about the FEMA Corps. That's that service program between FEMA and the AmeriCorps that's trying to recruit young people to get engaged before they're ready for a job, perhaps learn the ropes and then choose that as a career.
Yeah, no, and this is something that at GAO, we looked at this right after Hurricane Sandy, when FEMA Corps was first rolled out. I know when it first came out, they were trying to have this be, a force of several thousand young persons who could help them surge in the case of a major disaster. And we saw that they did that. I think the challenge that we saw with the FEMA Corps was just, plugging them into an existing complicated process too. I mean, there were a lot of things that they can do in the immediate response, things like helping, go door to door, get people information, talk to survivors, those types of things. But when it came down to some of the more technical processes that are involved in response or recovery, they may not have had the training that was necessary to do that. And so I think it was hard for FEMA field leaders who we talked to plug them in where it was necessary.
Well, maybe we ought to look at that training program and try to help fill some of these vacancies. And also there might be some additional incentives to attract people to the program, and then they'll stay in FEMA for a career.
Yes, ma'am. And I know that was the goal. We haven't looked at it again over the last 5 years or so, but what we've seen over time is the numbers of FEMA Corps kind of go down. I'm not sure what the exact numbers are now. I think it's in the hundreds, and it seems like they've gotten a little bit away from using FEMA Corps in their response efforts.
Well, we were talking about a climate corps, and I think a FEMA corps is a good thing, and we want to attract the best and brightest, get people interested in these jobs at an early age. So we might want to revisit that and see how we can bump it up some. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman.
Thank you so much. The gentlewoman yields back. And with that, I want to thank our witnesses for your valuable testimony today. Of course, we did not anticipate the change in our vote schedule. Votes were called in the middle of our hearing, but we were able to get through it. And I thank you so much for your patience. I also thank the members of both subcommittees who participated today in this very important discussion. And I look forward to working with our panelists on some of the issues that we discussed here today. The members of the subcommittees may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. The chair reminds members that the committee's record will remain open for 10 business days. Without objection, the subcommittees stand adjourned. Thank you all.